Hello, I'm Kevin O'Hare in the Office of Assessment and Accountability's Division of Assessment and Accountability Support. I would like to welcome you to the Inclusion of Special Populations training based on the Regulation 703 KAR 5-070. This training is required for anyone who will assist with the administration of a state assessment when providing or assisting with accommodations. Slide 2 shows the 5 parts that this training will represent. At this time, we will take a closer look at each of these areas and describe the intentions and specifics of each. The first part represents inclusion. Inclusion means to do just as it sounds, to include. An accommodation should never be provided as a means to give a student an unfair advantage over their peers or take something away. It is meant to provide the same level of opportunity as everyone else. To include in the same manner. In this part of the training, we are going to look at students who are included, those who are not, the difference in an accommodation and a modification. The last area we will dive into are the 3 options for participation in a state assessment. The first thing I want to direct your attention to on slide 3 is the blue arrow at the top of the page. The blue arrow reflects the location this information is found in the actual regulation document. Even though this training provides an in-depth look at all parts of the Inclusion of Special Populations regulation, it does not give every detail like the actual regulation does. If you need to know more, go to the regulation and look for the page number shared within this training. There are 6 sections covered in this regulation. Every section represents a different student group and the services they are eligible to receive under specific accommodations. The sections represented include students with IEPs, students who speak English as a second language, may have a specific access to a program service plan, and some may also require an IEP as well. Students who have a 504 plan or a medical emergency occurs and an accommodation is necessary. Students who are in an alternative or state agency setting. Students who receive instruction in home or hospital settings. And last, students who participate in the Kentucky Alternate Assessment. Most of all students are covered in this regulation in some way. However, there are some groups of students that this regulation does not represent. Those are students who may age out at 21 years of age or older. Students who are considered part-time students and may be enrolled in Kentucky Public Schools 6 hours or less per day. The last group would be students who are enrolled in a general education program or GED that is not part of a Kentucky public school system. As noted earlier, most students are represented throughout. Slide 5 shows that those that would not take part. Slide 6 looks at the difference between an accommodation and a modification when it comes to state assessments. Accommodations provide support but do not reduce learning expectations. Accommodations are individualized and specifically designed to aid learning and faded when skills are demonstrated in a progressive way over time. Modifications provide support during instruction in a way that assists students in the process of learning the content. To learn it during instruction may require one to provide that content in a different way. The ability to modify that curriculum will be acceptable while a student is being taught. However, it would not be an acceptable practice to change content during a state assessment. When modifying a state assessment, you could change the intent of the testing item or the content by making that modification, so that would not be permitted. A student's IEP team or Admissions and Release Committee, or ARC, must meet annually to determine the student's least restrictive environment and learning plan. The team will take into consideration through data-driven results, observations, formative and summative assessment, as well as other determining factors, the plans for adding or removing accommodations. There are 3 options for inclusion in a state assessment. They are with no accommodations, which means an accommodation is not needed or it is not eligible at the time of testing. Those with accommodations mean that the ARC or IEP team have met and developed the annual plan to include those accommodation types permitted for the student come testing time. The last option is that the student, even with access to the necessary accommodations, still is unable to access the general curriculum in a manner equivalent to their peers. The ARC or IEP team would then complete the participation guidelines for the Kentucky Alternate Assessment and assess the student in that way on a year-to-year basis. Slide 8 is one of 6 slides in this training that has been designed to highlight specific ways to try and reduce an allegation when administering a state assessment. Please do not think that these slides eliminate the chance for an allegation to occur, but the purpose behind them are to shine the spotlight on areas that the Office of Assessment and Accountability, along with the Office of Legal Services, Allegation Investigations, might see on a regular basis. This allegation prevention best practice tip is to always make sure students who receive accommodations through an IEP, 504, or program service plan have access to said accommodations routinely during instruction. The plan must be current, up to date, and a very important area we often see is that when a roster is being pulled for testing purposes in the Infinite Campus, it may not pull if that plan is not locked. All right. So for someone who does not work with a student on a day-to-day basis, without seeing their name on that roster, this is a way to not provide an accommodation. That in turn leads to an allegation. So you want to make sure that it's up to date. You want to make sure that they're receiving those accommodations routinely throughout the instructional year. And you also want to make sure that the plan is locked after the teacher or whoever has provided those changes has worked their way out of the system, that plan is locked just in case at the time that the roster is being pulled from Infinite Campus, they will show up there. This is the first check for understanding in this training. There are 7 total throughout and are provided to share the information that has been represented in the section of information leading up to the check. Let's get started. Question 1 reads, there are blank sections found in 703 KR 5-070, which is the Inclusions of Special Populations Regulation. How many sections are there? If you answered that there are 6 sections, you answered correctly. Question 2 asks, what is the age in Kentucky when students age out and are no longer eligible to receive services? Is it A, 19 years old, B, 25 years old, C, 21 years old, or D, 23 years old? If you said C, 21 years old, you answered correctly. Question 3 states, there are significant differences between an accommodation and a modification. Is that true or false? The correct answer is that is true. There are significant differences between an accommodation and a modification. As we noted, an accommodation is permitted and allowed on the state assessment, whereas a modification can and often does change the intent of the testing item or the content and therefore is not allowed on the state assessment. Question 4 asks, what are the 3 testing options for students eligible to receive services in Kentucky? Are they A, no accommodations, with accommodations, an alternate assessment, B, partial accommodations, permanent accommodations, due process, C, inclusion, non-inclusion, 504s, and IEPs, or in D, IEPs, 504s, and program service plans. If you answered A, you answered correctly. The 3 options are no accommodations, with accommodations, and the alternate assessment. The last question, question 5 on Check for Understanding 1, if a state assessment is modified, it can change the intent of the assessment item and invalidate test questions. Is that true or false? Well, as we just discussed just a minute ago on question 3, that is true. A modification can change the intent of the assessment item and invalidate test questions. Part 2 of this training looks at the various accommodation conditions identified in the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulation. When I say conditions, I mean accommodation conditions. You will notice on the top of slide 11, it talks about conditions 1 through 7. In the highlight on the title, you'll see accommodation condition, summary, and notes. In the notes section of slide 11, there are specific comments made about conditions 1 through 7. You will also note the page location for each condition, where it can be found in the regulation. Please reference the regulation for specific information to these conditions. Now, for a couple of examples of what I mean by what the notes offers in the conditions, an example, condition 1, used routinely during instruction. School staff must make available to the student accommodations used consistently as part of routine instruction and classroom assessment, but may not instruct their students on what or when to use accommodations. That's a student decision. Proctors may review with the student the accommodations in their IEP 504 plan or program service plan, remind students that proctors are there to provide the accommodations, and revisit this information at the beginning of each testing session. Students have the right to decline use of an accommodation if a student has adult provided accommodations, human, reader, scribe, or assistive technology. The adult or technology shall be in the testing room prior to testing and shall remain there during the testing period. Once again, it goes back to the student has the ability to request that has the access to those accommodations, and that they are reminded throughout that you can utilize these. You give these students access to these accommodations. If you're a human reader, they're going to understand that the reader is going to read that accommodation or going to read that information to the student. Whereas if they're utilizing assistive technology in some form, they are going to be familiar with that technology that's being utilized. In the note section of slide 12, there are specific comments made about conditions 8 through 13. You will also note that the page location for each condition where it can be found in the regulation is listed as well. Please reference the regulation for information specific to these conditions. Once again, a complete summary of these conditions are provided in the notes section on slides 11 and 12. This allegation prevention best practice tip is to make sure when a plan changes near the time of testing, it is documented well on conference summary and that there is evidence that supports that change. Also, anytime a change to a plan is made, especially close to test time, everyone involved with testing that student needs to be made aware of those changes made. It might be in the best interest to conduct a special meeting to discuss those plans before moving forward with any additional assessment practices. Check for understanding section 2. Question 1 asks, in part 2 of the Inclusion of Special Populations training, under these conditions, where can you find a detailed breakdown of each condition? Is it A, Regulation 5-070 on page 49? Is it B, Notes, slides 11 and 12? Is it C, Appendix P? Or is it D, both A and C? If you answered B, you answered correctly. You can find a detailed breakdown of each condition in the notes on slides 11 and 12. Question 2 reads, a student's plan should never be changed near or during a testing window. Is that true or false? The correct answer is false. Plans can change at any time as long as they are supported by data evidence, and everyone involved with testing is made aware when those changes occur. Based on a year-to-year rotation, an annual meeting is specific to the date it is supposed to be conducted. Sometimes these dates occur around testing windows at the end of the year. In that situation, if a plan does change, it needs to be evidenced in the conference summary. There needs to be information that supports that change, and that way it invalidates any questions or concerns that that change was made just for testing purposes. Question 3, an educational plan which is referencing an IEP, 504, or program service plan should always be based on a blank need and not a disability. If you said that the educational plan should always be based on an individual need and not a disability, you answered correctly. Question 4, why is it encouraged to fade an accommodation over time? Is it A, student independence, B, the plan is outdated, C, parent refusal, or D, due process? If you answered A, student independence, you answered correctly. Question 5, changing a plan for testing purposes only is always wrong and can often lead to the student performing poorly on the test. Is this true or false? That's true. One of the biggest concerns is when plans change near testing is that it is being done for testing purposes only. That is not allowed, as you'll read on numerous occasions throughout the regulation, inclusion of special populations regulation, but also it sometimes does more harm to that student because if they're not familiar with a particular accommodation, they've not used it routinely throughout the year, and then they're given access to it on a test session, that's probably going to cause more confusion than it's going to be beneficial. So absolutely never under any circumstances should a plan be changed just for testing purposes only. Part 3 of the inclusion of special populations training takes a more in-depth look at each section represented in this regulation. Section 1 of the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulation focuses on students who receive accommodation by way of an IEP. This information can be found on pages 8 through 16 of the regulation document. One of the focal points in this section is the importance of student involvement in the selection and use of accommodations. Students should have the opportunity at an appropriate time in their educational career to have input in their day-to-day education services. Many think the appropriate time to start involving a student in this process is the time they transition from elementary to middle school. There is nowhere that mandates this practice, but it has been noted on numerous occasions. The goal with an accommodation is to reduce or fade the use of that accommodation over time through improved instructional strategies and specifically designed instruction specific to that individual student. Progress towards independence is the overall goal for the student as they complete educational requirements in the public school setting and move to life after high school. As you may or may not be aware, everyone involved with testing is required to complete the administration code training. This particular training, 703 KR 5-070, Inclusion of Special Populations, is designed with those providing accommodations in mind. Many districts, however, find it as best practice to provide the administration code and the inclusion of special population trainings together. That way, all testing staff are trained and available for all areas of testing. Districts can decide who assists with accommodations during testing time. Section 2 of the Inclusion of Special Populations regulation focuses on students who are identified as English learners, or EL. This information can be found on page 16 through 22 of the regulation document. Students that enter school who have English as a second language will be administered the English Language Proficiency Assessment. Often when you discuss EL students and state assessments, the topic of a first-year exemption is talked about. This is true for first-year EL students new to the country. Students will not be expected to participate in reading. However, for mathematics and science, if they are tested at that grade, then a first-year EL student will be required to complete either 4 multiple choice items or 1 extended response item for participation only. Again, this is just for participation with no accountability. EL students will test with full accountability and participation beginning with year 2 and beyond. Section 3 of the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulation focuses on students who receive accommodations by way of a 504. Another topic focused on in this section is a medical emergency. This information can be found on pages 22 through 28 of the regulation document. Anyone who qualifies with a 504 must have a current plan. The 504 plan focuses more on use of an accommodation due to a health impairment, more so than a learning disability type. The other part of this section focuses on medical emergencies. A student who, for instance, has a broken dominant arm can receive an accommodation of a scribe under this section. Another example might be a student dependent on reading glasses. If those glasses are not available and another pair cannot be provided at or by the time of testing, a reader may be acceptable under these circumstances. Appropriate documentation must be kept on file at the school or district level. It is not required to be submitted to KDE. This documentation, this information can be found on the KDE website under Office of Assessment Accountability, Assessment Support under the Forms section. Section 4 of the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulation focuses on students who receive services through an alternative program. This section also talks about the requirements of state agency children. This information can be found on pages 28 through 29 of the regulation document. As we noted at the beginning of this training, the expectation is that all students enrolled in a Kentucky public school are expected to test unless they apply for and receive a medical or extraordinary circumstances non-participation. This also applies to students who are in an alternative program or setting. Alternative programs are considered non-A1 or non-accountable programs. A student is placed at that location to receive a service not afforded to them at their school or district of accountability. The school or district of accountability is where they would be enrolled if they were not in need of that service. Kentucky School for the Deaf and Kentucky School for the Blind are programs that provide services to students who would not be able to receive those same services at their school of accountability. State agency children, students who have been ordered or placed by the courts, are also expected to complete all state assessments unless an approved non-participation would apply. Section 5 of the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulation focuses on students who receive services in a homebound or hospital setting. This information can be found on page 29 of the regulation document. Homebound students or students placed in a hospital setting are also expected to participate in state assessments unless a medical or extraordinary circumstance prevents them from doing so. Many students who receive services in a home or hospital setting may be considered medically fragile and approved for a non-participation. For students who do test in these environments, they follow the same testing guidelines as applied for both students and test administrators. Test administrators who administer tests off-site or not at the School of Accountability must follow requirements set forth in both the Administration Code and the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulations. Section 6 of the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulation focuses on students who participate in the Kentucky Alternate Assessment. This information can be found on pages 30 through 35 of the regulation document. Students who qualify for the Kentucky Alternate Assessment are not able to access the general curriculum in the same manner as their peers, even with access to the majority of all available accommodations. This does not mean alternate assessment students are not allowed to have certain accommodations or their accommodations are different. It just means that the way the content or curriculum is provided to them may be different than students completing the general assessment. Students participating in the Kentucky Alternate Assessment are expected to follow the same guidelines for use of accommodations. However, there are a couple of instances that are shared in this training that would not be appropriate for students taking the regular assessment. Students are permitted to have a reader on both the regular and alternate assessments. However, the ability to reread is where the difference would apply. On the regular assessment, a student must request a reread. If a test administrator for the alternate assessment found the student to be unengaged or distracted, they could reread to the student based on their observation. Another example can be found on slides 31 and 32 talking about manipulatives. The key to participation in the Kentucky Alternate Assessment is that the ARC or IEP team must place the student based on the participation guidelines established by the Kentucky Department of Education. A student may not qualify unless the ARC or IEP team can answer yes to all parts of the Kentucky Alternate Assessment participation guidelines. Not some, not a few, all parts. If a no is determined at any time, then the student would not qualify for participation. A direct link to those participation guidelines can be found in the notes section of this slide. This allegation prevention best practice tip is to highlight specific training requirements and to focus on student refusal when receiving an accommodation on a state assessment. First, for anyone who is involved in a state assessment, they must receive the administration code training. For those providing or assisting with accommodations, they must receive the administration code and the inclusion of special populations trainings. Many districts do require both trainings to be completed by all test administrators and parties involved with state assessments. That is a local decision that may be enforced without the consent of KDE. In section 1, we talked about students being involved at an appropriate age to assist in their plan developments. We also discussed a student's ability to refuse the use of an accommodation at any time. This is not uncommon for a student to refuse an accommodation regardless of their reason. At the point of the student making that request, the test administrator should cease providing it at that time. The accommodation should only be provided again at the request of the student. Make sure to document any time a student denies use of an accommodation and if or when they request use of that accommodation as they test moving forward. Check for understanding 3. Question 1 reads, once the student reaches an age where they understand their plan and its development, it is important for them to participate because A, the student will not care, B, the student should understand, have a say in their plan, C, by law, the student must participate, or D, the plan will expire. The correct answer is B, the student should understand and have a say in their plan. Once a student has reached a point where they understand and feel comfortable with the plan they are provided, they should be involved in the process. In reality, the student should understand their capabilities better than most and have the ability to make important decisions such as this. So if you answered B, you answered it correctly. Question 2 states, EL students only receive a first year one-time exemption. The second year and beyond requires full participation. Is this true or false? The correct answer is true. A student new to the U.S. and enrolls in a public school receives a one-time exemption for accountability. They are still asked to participate to a small degree, but their scores are not to be held accountable. The second year and beyond, they participate fully. Question 3. Forms for medical emergencies should always remain in the blank. If you answered that forms for medical emergency should always remain in the school or district, then you answered question 3 correctly. Question 4. State agency children and students in a hospital setting are expected to take the state assessment unless an approved non-participation has been granted. Is that true or false? The correct answer to question 4 is true. State agency children and students in a hospital setting are expected to take the state assessment unless an approved non-participation has been granted. For question 5, to qualify for the Kentucky Alternate Assessment, which parts of the participation guidelines must be answered with yes? Is it A, all, B, half, C, only questions 1 and 2, or is it D, A, B, and C are incorrect? The correct answer to question 5 is A, all. All parts of the Kentucky Alternate Assessment Participation Guidelines must be answered by yes through the IEP team or the IEP team or the ARC committee in order for a student to fully qualify and participate in the Kentucky Alternate Assessment. Now, we are going to ask Jason Howard to discuss the many accommodations available in state assessments, how they are provided, and the very important points related to each. Jason, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. As Kevin mentioned, I am Jason Howard with the Office of Assessment and Accountability's Division of Assessment and Accountability Support. Now we will switch gears and talk about how the testing environment can impact the way an accommodation is provided. With a rapid move to online testing, this is something that must be covered. The important takeaway is that the rules and regulations that govern accommodations do not change. A scribe can still only record what the student instructs the scribe to write. A reader can still only read the words as they are written exactly on the test. Nothing changes in what accommodators and accommodations may do or provide. What changes is the medium in which the students and the accommodators are interacting with the test. Some of the accommodations which may look a little different are scribe, human reader, stop the clock, calculator, dictionary thesaurus, and assistive technology. This is not an exhaustive list. To know exactly how these accommodations can be provided on a specific test, it is imperative to read the documentation for the test being proctored. For instance, one test may be an online test, and a calculator accommodation is provided online. Another test may be an online test as well, but calculators may be offered only via handheld calculators. Each test can have different accommodations, but all accommodations provided on any test must adhere to the regulations covered in this training. On the screen, you will notice a very basic example of how testing environment can impact the way an accommodation is provided. However, it does not impact the regulations that govern the limits of an accommodation. So let's say we have two tests. Test A is given completely online. There is not a paper pencil option at all. Test B is given completely paper and pencil. There is no online option. In these strict environments, it would require accommodations to look a little different. If one medium is paper and pencil and the other is online, but accommodations are still required, they will necessarily look a little different in how they are provided. For instance, on test A, the online only test, a scribe may become a typist. But on test B, the paper and pencil test, all responses will be handwritten by the scribe. What the scribe can do does not change. The scribe still may only record word for word what the student says. Human reader on the online test without a paper option, the reader would simply read the computer screen. On the paper and pencil test, they would read the paper test book. Stop the clock on an online test is likely controlled within the testing platform, whereas on a paper and pencil test, it would have to be manually logged. Calculators on an online-only test are likely provided within the testing platform, but on a paper pencil test, a handheld calculator would have to be provided. Once again, the accommodations themselves are the exact same. This is also an extreme example of a test only given in one medium or another. Often, tests, much like our state K-Prep tests, are provided in multiple formats that include both online and paper and pencil versions. That is why it is imperative that you read the literature regarding how to provide accommodations for each and every test you provide accommodations for. Now to recap. To recap the impact testing environment has on accommodations. First, all rules within this training and regulation regarding accommodations still apply to any accommodations provided regardless of the testing environment. A scribe, whether typing or writing, can still only record information as provided by the student. A reader, whether reading from a computer screen or a paper booklet, still may only read what is written within the test. 2. Because online and paper pencil tests are interacted with differently, one you manually bubble in items with a pencil and the other you point and click with a mouse, for instance, how accommodations are provided can vary from test to test, while what an accommodation can provide does not change. How it is provided can. 3. If you are providing accommodations, it is imperative that you review all testing literature for the test being given and understand how accommodations are to be provided for that specific exam. This can differ widely from test to test. An example of this, the ACT allows triple time. The K-Prep does not. It is never a good idea to assume because you have provided accommodations on one online test that things will be the exact same on another online test. Always read the testing literature prior to administration. And fourth, if you need further assistance before improperly providing accommodations, contact us at dacinfo@education.ky.gov. Now we're going to move into our check for understanding number 4. For those using this as a live training video with a group of teachers, I want to note that after I read each question and answer choices, I will take a brief pause, so you may stop the video and discuss as a group before the answer and rationale is given. 1. When administering the online version of the state assessment, instead of paper and pencil, what can a reader do differently to help a student take the test? A. Reread questions. B. Read with inflection. C. Read from an internet-enabled cell phone screen. Or D. The rules are the same. The answer is D. As discussed in Module 4 of this training, what an accommodator is allowed to do and not do remains the same whether a test is given online or via paper and pencil. 2. Which of the following is not a requirement prior to providing accommodations? A. Read all manuals and testing literature for the test being given. B. Read from a computer screen if given an online test. C. Have inclusions of special population administration code training. Or D. Verify all accommodations are current for the student prior to providing them. The answer is B. While this may be appropriate for students that have a human reader accommodation, this is not a requirement for administering state tests at all. 3. If a test administrator has given one online state test early in the school year, do they already understand how to provide accommodations for another online state test later in that same school year? The answer is B, or false. While what an accommodation can do remains the same from test to test, for instance, a reader may never provide answers to questions regardless of the test or testing format, how the accommodation is provided must be compatible with the testing platform. So while the role of a reader or scribe remains unchanged, how those accommodations are provided can differ from test to test. Always read the literature for the specific test you are providing accommodations for. 4. Depending on the accommodation, the rules that govern accommodations that will be taught in this training change depending upon whether the state test is administered online or paper and pencil. The answer is B, or false. The rules for each accommodation remain unchanged from the regulation regardless of what format the test is being given. 5. The test administrator is providing scribing services for a student taking the state assessment online. What is the best way to find out how that accommodation should be provided? A. Review the inclusion of special populations regulation for the answer. B. Review the testing manual for the test being given for proper instruction. C. Review this training again. Or D. Ask a colleague down the hall. The answer is B. For that specific test, the best resource for determining how to provide the scribe accommodation would be the testing literature itself. While this training and the regulation would certainly help you understand what a scribe can and cannot do when providing the scribing accommodation, neither one will instruct you on how to perform the scribe accommodation within the platform that specific test is being administered. Now we are going to dive into the conditions for specific accommodation on state test and the rules that govern what can and cannot be done when providing those accommodations as laid out by the Inclusions of Special Populations regulation. On the screen are the most used, but not the only, accommodations allowed on state testing. We will go into each one individually. We're going to start with assistive technology. Assistive technology is allowed and encouraged on state testing. However, it is imperative that you make sure any assistive technology used is compatible with the test being given. Any assistive technology that reproduces, retransmits, saves, replicates, or serves as a pass-through for secured test materials cannot be used due to testing security concerns. However, many assistive technology options exist for state testing. Some things to consider for the use of technology. First, program planners should always evaluate under what conditions a student will use technology and clearly describe in that student's plan when and how it will be used. An example, if a student uses a text reader instead of a human reader, that should be clearly indicated on the student's plan. Second, technology should be considered first in order to help foster independence. The goal is for independence to carry over into post-school activities. A teacher cannot move on with the student in the post-education life, but technology can go everywhere that student goes after they leave the school. This is not an all-inclusive list of assistive technology, but it's just a handful of the ones that are most commonly used. We're going to go through a few of them. Talking calculators can be requested for students that need them by submitting a non-approved calculator request to the Office of Assessment and Accountability along with a justification for the use of one. Text readers allowed on most state testing. Each test will have its own rules on how accommodations are to be provided. Audio CDs, much like text reader, are offered on most state testing. Each test will have its own rules on how accommodations are to be provided. Non-standard response templates are on the website year-round, and they're there for students to practice with and become comfortable using. There are 3 templates online that allow students to practice with different answer links throughout the school year, leading up to test time. If they use a short answer, extended response, and on-demand writing templates during instruction, they will be familiar with their capabilities and be ready for testing. All other types of assistive technology are allowed, provided they are compatible with the testing platform and produce no security risk to secure test material. If you have further questions, contact dacinfo@education.ky.gov for further assistance. Manipulatives are allowed on state tests, but are required to be one-to-one testing environment due to the individualized aspect of the accommodation. The rules for manipulatives are, as laid out by the inclusion regulations, are as follows. Each student is allowed a 3x5 note card. That card, however, should not contain any written text or labels for the students not taking alternate assessment. This can serve to help organize the students' thoughts. Students with visual impairments may enlarge the 3x5 card to make the card usable. The manipulative placement during the assessment should be consistent with where the placement is during instruction. The student has to choose which manipulative they want to use and when they want to use it. Alternate assessment students can have writing and labels on their note card as long as it is not content. Once developed, visually impaired students can have their 3x5 note card increased to a size they can read. Students should have access to every manipulative included on their student plan, whether it be used or not. For instance, if a student has 20 manipulatives written down on their IEP, all 20 should be provided on the test to the student on test day, and not only the ones the accommodator feels will be most useful for the content being tested. Now let's take a look at the 3x5 note card examples on the next slide. Each student with the manipulatives accommodation is allowed a single 3x5 note card. You will notice that the general 3x5 note card can have shapes or diagrams, but cannot have writing or labels of any kind. A student taking the alternate assessment can have labels, such as first, second, third on a note card, but cannot have content. So while first, second, third are okay, it would not be okay to have first, write a thesis statement, second, order the body paragraphs to tackle evidence for the claims, and third, write a conclusion which ties the thesis to the evidence. That wouldn't be okay. So let's move on to check for understanding number 5. For those using this as a live training video with a group of teachers, I want to note that after I read each of these questions and answer choices, I will take a brief pause so you may stop the video and discuss as a group before the answer and rationale is given. 1. Why should technology be considered as an early accommodation? A. It is easier. B, they provide essential modifications. C, technology carries over to post-school activities. Or D, dependence on technology is ideal. The answer is C. Technology helps foster independence and can carry over to post-school activities for the child once they exit the public education system. 2. A student is familiar with two forms of reading accommodations: the classroom teacher reading to him and using a text reader. What is one important reason the text reader might be considered as a first option? A. Text readers provide necessary modifications. B. The teacher cannot go with the student after they graduate. Text readers can. C. The teacher cannot read as fluently or as accurately as a text reader. Or D. Text readers foster dependence. The answer is B. The goal of using technology to provide accommodations is to help foster independence. Once that student enters adult life, their teacher will not be there to read for them. Knowing how to use a screen reader, however, will allow the student to have those services even as an adult. 3. Manipulatives should always be a one-to-one accommodation because they are unique to each student. Is that true or false? The answer is A, or true. Any accommodation which is unique to a student should be given in a one-to-one environment. This includes the use of manipulatives. 4. Manipulatives should be placed where in the testing room? A, the student's desk. B, a separate room. C, a central location away from the student's desk that the student may get up and access during the test. Or D, on a computer or electronic device. The answer is C. Manipulatives should always be placed in a location away from the student's test, but it is easily accessible by the student during testing. 5. A student not taking the alternate assessment may have a 3x5 note card among their manipulatives as long as what condition or conditions are met? A, only labels, but no content is on the index card. B, no content, writing, or labels are allowed to be on the card. C, graphic organizers are allowed as long as they are writing and content free. Or D, both B and C are correct. The answer is D. For a student taking general assessment, their 3x5 note card may not have any writing, content, or labels of any kind on them. Graphic organizers are okay as long as there is 0 labels, content, or writing on those graphic organizers. Now let's dive into readers. So readers of multiple varieties are available in state testing. Each individual test will have literature that guides you on how each reader is to be provided. So one of the first ones we talk about is like text-to-speech. Text-to-speech is allowed for students with an IEP, 504, PSP, or alternate assessment plan. A reader can read everything from cover to cover in the assessment to the students. If the student requests to read parts independently, that is allowed and the proctor must stop reading at that point. All students have the right to great instruction, so giving an accommodation does not relieve the teacher, school, or district of the responsibility of giving the student top-notch instruction. Some other highlights. A reader must always watch for inflections and emphatic speech when reading. This is of particular concern for human readers. The job of a reader is never to lead a student to an answer. You must have documentation over time that with intervention and high quality instruction, the student is still unable to access the reading assessment. And the goal of any accommodation should be to phase it out over time and grow a student to be independent. Now let's dive deeper into what a reader may do. Keep in mind these rules apply to any reader in any testing environment. So first, any reader must read the directions, prompts, situations, and passages as they are written in the test exactly. Must be verbatim. 2, a reader may not use or provide any additional information even if requested by the student. 3, A reader may reread any part of the test to the student only after the student requested and the students are taking the general assessment. Now, if a student is taking the alternate assessment, they are scripted assessments. And so test administrators can determine when a student is not focused and may reread at any time, but that only goes for the alternate assessment. General assessment, the student must ask for the reread. 4. A reader may not point out parts of the question or task that have been skipped by the student. 5. A reader may read individual words or abbreviations mispronounced by a text or screen reader. And 6, a reader may not lead a student to an answer. Remember, no emphatic speech when reading. These rules apply to any state test given in any format and whether the student is taking the test online or paper and pencil. Now, let's look at some ways to prevent allegations or best practices to engage in when providing a reader. So first, a reader should never guide or direct the student to a correct response. When reading to a student, the test administrator should never change a test item or answer options, even at the student's request. So even if the student asks you, what does that word mean, or can you give me a different example, you cannot do that. 2, a reread may be provided only at the request of the student. Now, again, that only goes for general population kids taking the general K-Prep or general test. The only time the test administrator is permitted to reread something without a student request is for the alternate assessment. That is the only time. Now, let's dive deeper into what a scribe may do. Keep in mind, these rules apply to any scribe in any testing environment. A scribe cannot be given, or a student cannot be given a scribe just because he or she has bad handwriting or because they write slowly. There must be documentation of the disability's impact on the student's writing, showing he or she is performing significantly and consistently below same age peers. A scribe merely writes what the student says. The student must remain the sole creator and editor at all times. A district has discretion on who can serve as a scribe, but they cannot allow peer tutors. And a scribe cannot be used as a replacement for writing instruction or assistive technology. How a scribe records answers for a student may be different from one state test to the next based upon the medium the test is being given. An online test may require a scribe to type. A paper pencil test may require a scribe to write the answer. This will be covered for each test within the test literature for each specific test, but the role of the scribe never changes. And so what is the role of the scribe? So a scribe must, regardless of testing format, remember online, paper, pencil, this is the exact same. They must first record word for word what the student says. Second, they should only format, capitalize, and punctuate as directed by the student. Third, they should give the written or typed product to the student to edit or revise. And fourth, and lastly, they should not alter, edit, or revise the student's own ideas, revisions, or edits. These rules never change whether a test is given online or paper and pencil. Now let's look at some ways to prevent allegations or best practices to engage in when providing the scribe accommodation. So first, a scribe should only provide the exact information the student provides. All answers must be directed and guided by the student at all times. 2, a scribe should only provide the writing support to a student when they have additional accommodations permitted on the test. For example, the scribe could not read a response back to the student unless that student also has a reader on their plan. Now let's move into check for understanding number 6. For those using this as a live training video with a group of teachers, I want to note that after I read each question and answer choices, I will take a brief pause so you may stop the video and discuss as a group before the answer and rationale is given. 1. Which of the following is not a role of the reader? A. Reading the test book cover to cover. B. Pointing out parts of questions or tasks skipped by the student. C. Reread any part of the test that the student requested. Or D. read individual words or abbreviations the text or audio reader mispronounces. The answer is B. As a reader, you are not allowed to point out mistakes or errors the student has previously and/or is actively making. Your only allowed job is to read the test booklet for the student. 2. If a student does not understand a word or phrase in a passage or question, is it okay to summarize or explain that text to the student in the language they understand? A, always no. B, always yes. C, yes, if they have paraphrasing or simplified language accommodations. D, no, paraphrasing or simplified language accommodations apply to directions only. The answer is A. Even if a student has a paraphrasing or simplified language accommodation, that only applies to directions. It is never okay to summarize or explain anything within the assessment portion of a test booklet to a student. Now, this is a tricky question because D could also seem like a correct answer. However, it does not fully answer the question, and the answer seems to imply it would be okay otherwise. The more appropriate and correct answer is A. It's simply never okay to do. 3. A student is provided a reader, scribe, and paraphrasing accommodation or IEP. The test administrator is reading the test. The student requests the reader to reread the passage and define a word that is not understood. Is this allowed? A, yes to both. The student has reader and paraphrasing and rereads are allowed. B, no to both. Rereads are not allowed. C, yes to the reread. The reread is allowed, but paraphrasing test content is not allowed. D, no to the reread. Rereads are not allowed, but the paraphrasing is okay. So the answer is C. The student is allowed to request a reread, and that may be fulfilled. However, test content, even with the paraphrasing and accommodation, may never be defined, summarized, or changed under any circumstances. 4. Who cannot serve as a scribe, even if they have received the inclusions of special population training? A, a special education teacher. B, a peer tutor. C, a substitute teacher. Or D, a counselor. The answer is B. The regulation specifically bars peer tutors from being a scribe. 5. Which of the following must a scribe do to ensure they prevent an allegation? A, record only the exact information a student provides in the answer box. B, reread the answer the student provided and require the student to provide all edits to the answer. C, never read the answer back to the student under any circumstances. Or D, correct all mistakes within the written answer for the student. The answer is A. As a scribe, your only job is to record the exact information provided by the student with the answer box given. The student must direct or provide any edits. Remember, to read back the answer to the student, they would also have to have a reader accommodation. So let's move forward to calculators. So calculators are available on state test in handheld, online, or both forms depending upon the test being given. Regardless of the medium that the calculator is provided, whether it is in handheld or an online variety, the rules that govern their usage remain the same. To use a calculator, a student must first have the need documented on their plan, which includes documentation of disability's impact on mathematics, calculation, and reasoning. And they should have used the calculator in routine instruction throughout the year. If a student has a valid calculator accommodation, then that calculator is allowed on all sections, including the non-calculator section of test. It should be noted the calculator accommodation is a disability accommodation and is not an EO accommodation. When we talk about paraphrasing or simplified language, the rules remain the same regardless of the test is given online or paper and pencil. The important thing to know about paraphrasing and simplified language is that it is directions only, as noted by the blue highlight. These directions only include the directions prior to the test beginning and does not include directions embedded within a test item. For instance, if you have a science question and it has directions on, say, embedded in the test question itself, even though those are tagged as directions, they still could not be paraphrased because the test time has started, it's part of a test question, those aren't allowed. It's only the directions prior to the test beginning. Further, paraphrasing and simplified language do not include defining words or concepts, teaching vocabulary, or telling a student what to do first, second, etc. Reading passages and content passages may not be paraphrased as that would impact content validity. Oral native language support is not limited to any specific time frame. As long as the student has a PSP, he or she is still eligible to have oral native language support if needed. This may range from specific vocabulary to rendering entire assessments in the student's native language. A student can have you translate a single word, a single paragraph, or the entire test. It's up to them. This includes directions and all parts of the test that the student needs translated. And here at KDE, in the Office of Assessment and Accountability, we do have flexibility of administrations for oral native language support. If you're having trouble providing enough translators, you can contact our office at dacinfo@education.ky.gov and we'll work with you on that. Bilingual or English dictionaries are available on some state tests. They can be print or electronic. It should be noted that you need to read the testing literature for each state test on how the dictionary should be provided. Some may require a handheld dictionary. Some may require the use of an embedded dictionary in the testing platform, and others may require the use of an electronic version on a tablet or exterior device. Some state tests may not even allow the accommodation at all. It is important to read all test administrative manuals for each test being administered to determine how to handle this accommodation. If allowed on the test you're administering, there are some specific guidelines that must be followed. First, bilingual or English dictionary should only provide a word-to-word translation without definitions. Further, all additional capabilities must be turned off. This includes the internet. Now let's look at some ways to prevent allegations or best practices to engage in when providing paraphrasing, simplified language, or old native language support. First, there is flexibility to a test schedule on a state assessment, but it is not permitted unless a student has oral native language support marked on the PSP. If there is a shortage of interpreters, EL students should use a different test administration schedule than the regular student population. The altered schedule must occur within the district established testing window. 2. Paraphrasing or simplified language under no circumstances can be provided on any part of a state assessment except for directions only. Extended time is allowed on state assessments for those taking the general assessment. Extended time is not an alternate assessment accommodation because it's not a timed test. Extended time can be in the form of time and a half or double time based on a committee or team decision for that student based on data and observation. Regular time must be used appropriately in order to receive extended time. If, for some reason, a student does not use regular time appropriately, let's say, for example, they slept for 55 minutes of an hour-long test, you may deny extended time to that student. Make sure you document everything in as much detail as you can muster and turn it into the building assessment coordinator so they can properly document why the student was denied extra time. If a student has worked diligently and indicates verbally or non-verbally that they need extended time, then they should be provided extended time based on the guidelines in the building assessment coordinator has laid out. Some schools keep the student in the same testing room, while others relocate them to a library or lounge. This is all a local decision, but follow building protocols for those students. Reinforcement and behavior modification strategies are allowed on state tests. This can include testing a student with behavior issues in a one-to-one environment, which is a local decision, to prevent disruption for other students. This should be an ARC or a 504 team decision, and it should be based on data. You can use verbal, tangible, or tactile reinforcements for being on task. Once again, these students can be tested in a separate location outside the regular classroom. The important thing is that any modification used cannot impact or disturb other students. You can use technology to focus attention or reduce stress of those students. However, it should be noted that the use of technology for these students does not mean they can use the text reader audio CD. It means if a student is given computer time as a reward for on-task behavior, then that student would still get that after testing is completed for the day. Alternate assessment students can have their breaks during the assessment since the alternate assessment is not a timed assessment. Reinforcement and behavior modifications are a disability accommodation, and they are not an EL accommodation. Interpreters for students with deafness or a hearing impairment. So students must have a verified disability in the area of hearing to the degree that the development of language is significantly impacted and uses sign language as a normal mode of communication. The interpreter shall not indicate correct answers or define words or provide content or teach vocabulary or concepts. If the interpreter is also a scribe, he or she must adhere to the policy for scribing as well. Check for understanding number 7. For those using this as a live training video with a group of teachers, I want to note that after I read each question and answer choices, I will take a brief pause so you may stop the video and discuss as a group before the answer and rationale is given. If a student qualifies for a calculator accommodation, the student may use the calculator on any test, including the non-calculator portions of exams. Is that true or false? The answer is A, or true. If a student qualifies for a calculator accommodation, they are permitted to use a calculator on any test, whether that test allows the use of a calculator or not. 2. Which of the following examples of paraphrasing or simplified language may be provided on a state test? A. Paraphrasing the directions embedded within a test item. B. Simplifying a test question by changing words to their simpler words. C. Simplifying the directions provided prior to the test beginning. Or D. Both A and C. The answer is C. Only directions provided prior to the test are allowed to be paraphrased or simplified. 3. Which of the following is not true about the uses of bilingual dictionaries? A. They must be printed. B. They should only provide word-to-word translations without definitions. C. They may be electronic. Or D. Internet or additional capabilities must be turned off. The answer is A. This is a tricky question because bilingual dictionaries may be printed copies. Those, however, do not have to be provided. Electronic copies are also allowed. 4. If a student is denied extended time on a state test, the test administrator should do the following. A. Take thorough notes on why the decision was made. B. Contact the building assessment coordinator and inform them of why the decision was made and provide them with the notes. C. Both A and B. Or D. None of the above. So the answer is C. If a student is denied extended time on a state test, the test administrator should take thorough notes on why the decision was made and provide those notes and notification as soon as possible to the building assessment coordinator for proper documentation. 5. A student has behavior modification on his or her IEP and routinely disrupts normal classroom instruction. What needs to be done to test the student one-to-one? A. Contact KDE for prior approval. B. Contact US Ed for prior approval. C. Choose not to test the student. Or D. Follow district procedures. KDE will leave this decision to the local school systems. The answer is D. This is a local decision that does not require the involvement of KDE or USED. Simply follow the district procedures, and if you're unsure what those procedures are, contact your building assessment coordinator or your district assessment coordinator. This concludes the inclusion of special populations regulation training. If you have specific questions about the inclusion of special populations training, please feel free to contact KDE DAC information at dacinfo@education.ky.gov, or you can call 502-564-4394. Thank you.